Man, leave them alone.
This morning, two new major American cities now in the crosshairs of President Trump's ongoing crusade against illegal immigration.
Can you put handcuffs on him, please?
The Department of Homeland Security saying raids in New Orleans.
Community is being targeted by federal immigration forces.
In the wake of the National Guard shooting, the Trump administration now says that they have paused immigration applications for people from 19 countries. That includes requests for green cards and U.S. citizenship.
When the clock struck 4 a.m. in Minnesota, an unprecedented federal operation began to unfold. Nearly 800 agents from multiple agencies simultaneously conducted raids on 19 locations across the Twin Cities area. The objective: to completely dismantle an organized paramilitary-style criminal organization that had secretly built a logistics empire within the United States. The operation, codenamed Iron Harvest, had been meticulously prepared for months. Armored convoys rolled from staging bases on the outskirts of Minneapolis and St. Paul under cover of darkness. Engines operated at their quietest settings, lights dimmed to minimum levels, tires gliding smoothly over frozen pavement. Above, helicopters flew in stealth mode along the Mississippi River corridor. Tactical teams tightened their gloves, performed final checks on optical equipment, waiting for the order that would shatter the silence across the state. Minnesota was not a place Americans typically associated with international criminal infiltration. However, the very elements that contributed to the region's prosperity, its extensive rail network, trucking hubs, distribution centers, and warehouse belts also created the perfect blind spot. Goods moved everywhere daily, containers stacked like steel monuments to the Midwest economy. This environment provided the criminal network with everything they needed. The first trace. The first crack appeared 6 months earlier. A confidential source reported an anomaly at a riverside warehouse in St. Paul. A container labeled as humanitarian aid arrived after midnight without clear shipping documentation. When the seal was broken for inspection, what emerged was not medical supplies or relief food. These were rifle components wrapped in oil-soaked cloth, the type used to protect military weapons from moisture. Long barrel sections, upper receivers, and bolt carriers, designed for combat rifles, rarely appeared in the U.S. outside controlled channels. When the Department of Homeland Security investigations received the report, their response was immediate and grave. Minnesota had witnessed drug networks, fraud rings, and trafficking operations. But not this. Rifle components linked to East African conflicts, moving through the state under humanitarian labels, meant one thing. This wasn't just a drug trafficking or money laundering operation. They were building infrastructure. The complete picture. ICE escalated the case within hours. The FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force joined the next day. ATF began tracing the weapon components. DEA flagged chemical signatures and narcotics seized across the Twin Cities. Suddenly, a picture formed. Initially blurry, then unmistakable. Couriers using refrigerated freight trucks for disguised transport, a technique designed to mask heat signatures. Transit apartments rotating weekly through densely populated neighborhoods. Encrypted messages routed through overseas servers. Violence around certain transportation hubs that never made the news, but always followed the network's movement patterns. Everything pointed to one truth. This network was not small, not new, and deeply entrenched. The multi-agency task force spent months mapping the hidden infrastructure beneath Minnesota's calm surface. Surveillance units tracked unusual nighttime activity around suburban warehouses. Undercover operatives infiltrated repair shops where trucks received unexplained maintenance. Wiretaps captured coded terms. Long bones, night cargo, cold engines. All later decoded as references to rifles, narcotics, and insulated transport. Federal prosecutors concluded there was sufficient evidence not just to indict, but to completely dismantle this network. 0 hour. A strike had to occur before dawn at multiple points simultaneously. At 3:30 a.m., the command center came alive. Digital maps displayed 19 marked locations, stash sites, fortified townhouses, communication rooms embedded within apartment complexes, and 2 suspected command hubs. At 3:45 a.m., sniper teams took positions on rooftops overlooking industrial corridors. At 3:50 a.m., aviation units signaled readiness. At 3:55 a.m., armored vehicles aligned in staggered formations. And at exactly 4 a.m., the operation began. The raid erupts. Convoys surged into the darkness. Agents advanced. Minnesota held its breath. The largest federal operation in the state's history had officially commenced. The first breach occurred at the St. Paul Riverside Industrial District. A warehouse built like a bunker with reinforced doors and braced loading bays withstood the initial impact. The battering ram struck, Steele groaned. Before the second strike landed, gunfire erupted from inside. Not panicked, wildfire but controlled bursts with methodical patterns. Shooters were already in defensive positions. Agents dove for cover as glass shattered from upper windows. Snipers identified two firing angles and neutralized both shooters with clean precision. A flashbang rolled into the darkness. The door collapsed and federal teams rushed inside. The interior was a maze of forklifts, containers, and improvised barriers. 3 silhouettes fled, one shooting, one climbing, one racing toward an exit. All were neutralized within seconds. In Minneapolis, a converted duplex being used as a transit apartment resisted standard breach procedures. The door frame was reinforced with welded steel bracing, forcing operators to deploy explosive charges. The door blew inward, the hallway filled with dust, and a courier attempted to leap through a rear window. He landed in the snow, only to be immediately intercepted by perimeter agents. The final fortress. In Brooklyn Park, the most fortified position erupted before the team even approached the entrance. Automatic gunfire tore through the siding, sending insulation material flying into the air like shredded fabric. Agents scattered for cover. A sniper across the street identified the firing position and sent 2 rounds through an upper window, silencing the shooter. Seconds later, a rear entry team flooded the house and secured the remaining occupants. But the fiercest resistance awaited inside the Egan warehouse, the suspected command hub. From the outside, it looked like any other industrial facility. Inside, it was a fortified labyrinth. Drone feeds showed frantic movement. Figures dragging crates, blocking corridors, taking elevated positions. When the armored convoy boxed in the building, escape became impossible. The battering rams smashed through the loading dock. Tactical teams entered in layered formations. The interior exploded into chaos. Gunfire cracking from catwalks, shadows darting across steel beams. Commands echoing through the vast space. Fighters attempted to hold the high ground, but the federal push was relentless. A breacher detonated charges on an interior office wall, exposing a hidden command cell, lined with encrypted tablets, radio equipment, shipping route maps, and crates, labeled with falsified humanitarian markings. The firefight was violent but brief. The warehouse fell. The command room was secured. The inner tier of leadership had nowhere left to run. Aftermath and discoveries. With the primary sites breached and the network reeling from the coordinated strike, federal teams shifted from assault to extraction, containment, and intelligence recovery. The objective was no longer just to seize locations. It was to pull apart the entire structure the network had built across Minnesota piece by piece until every layer was exposed. Inside the first warehouse seized in Street Paul, agents began the slow, meticulous process of converting chaos into evidence. The floor was a battlefield. Shattered crates, shell casings, broken pallets. Forensic technicians marked each casing with neon identifiers, photographed blood trails, and cataloged every weapon left behind. Beneath a false wall constructed from stacked pallets, investigators found an array of rifles wrapped in oilcloth, each disassembled into transport-ready segments. Serial markings were either filed off or never applied, a hallmark of conflict zone manufacturing. ATF ballistic specialists immediately recognized the machining patterns. These were the same components traced to East African militia lines. In Minneapolis, inside the blown-out duplex, agents uncovered what had once been a functioning transit cell. Thick binders lay scattered across a kitchen table. Delivery logs disguised as maintenance records, route maps drawn with colored markers to indicate which hours offered the lowest law enforcement visibility, and envelopes filled with cash meant for rotating couriers. Command center. But the biggest breakthrough came from the seized command node in Egan. Behind the blown office wall, the command cell looked less like a criminal hideout and more like an overseas operations post. Multiple monitors displayed live container tracking dashboards. A corkboard pinned with shipping lanes ran from Mombasa to the port of Montreal, then to Duluth, then into the Minnesota rail grid. Colored strings connected African ports to Twin Cities warehouses with alarming clarity. Ledger books documented cash movements flowing through Minneapolis financial cooperatives, wire transfers routed through Somali remittance networks, and purchases of commercial vehicles under shell company names. Most revealing were the digital tablets still logged in when agents entered. Chat logs showed encrypted communications with overseas contacts, confirmation of shipments disguised under humanitarian titles, and discussions about expanding distribution into Wisconsin, Illinois, and Michigan. One thread referenced the Northern Corridor opening soon, a phrase analysts interpreted as a plan to push deeper into the Midwest, using Minnesota as the primary hub. The operation continues. However, The operation was not complete. Several mid-level operatives had fled during the initial breaches, slipping into alleyways, cutting through backyards, or diving into abandoned industrial zones. Rapid response teams pursued heat signatures to rooftops, alley corners, and empty container yards. Some suspects attempted to regroup in a grain elevator complex south of the river, using the rusted machinery as elevated cover. Agents fanned out, using concrete silos as shields during a brief but intense exchange. The suspects were subdued without allowing them to signal anyone else. From Savage to Fridley, from Bloomington to Maplewood, the task force executed systematic sweeps. Storage units revealed vacuum-sealed methamphetamine bricks, marked with organizational symbols. Garage workshops contained molds for hiding contraband inside engine compartments. Apartments yielded torn notebooks detailing payouts, enforcement orders, and warnings about federal surveillance. Lessons and warnings. When agents completed the first round of sweeps, the amount of seized evidence filled multiple transport trucks, weapons, cash, ledgers, tablets, phones, maps, hard drives, financial documents. The threads pointed not only across the state, but across the ocean. Operation Iron Harvest had torn open the heart of a hidden infrastructure, a structure designed to survive, adapt, and permanently embed itself into Minnesota's logistics spine. And the deeper agents dug, the more they realized how close the state had come to becoming a central node in an international system operating in the shadows. With the final sweeps completed and the strongholds dismantled, the Twin Cities entered a strange, heavy stillness. Federal convoys still rolled through industrial corridors. Helicopters traced slow arcs above the river. Tactical teams rotated between staging points and evidence sites. But the fear that had once pulsed beneath Minnesota's logistics backbone, the unseen presence that had guided shipments, moved weapons, managed couriers, was no longer in control. For the first time in years, order in the region belonged entirely to law enforcement. Yet victory did not feel simple. It rarely does when the enemy is woven into the machinery of a city. In neighborhoods that had unwittingly hosted transit apartments and courier routes, residents stepped outside to watch black SUVs disappear into the early morning haze. Some had sensed for months that something was off. Unmarked vans arriving at odd hours, the quiet shuffling of crates behind closed warehouse doors, strange groups occupying the same parking lots week after week. Others never suspected anything. Now the truth was revealed in press briefings, press releases, and statements filtered through city channels. The network had created a covert logistics empire in Minnesota, an empire stretching from local apartment complexes to international shipping lanes. State and federal leaders stood shoulder to shoulder at a press conference in downtown Minneapolis. They spoke cautiously, emphasizing cooperation between agencies and the scale of the threat dismantled. Charts displayed seized weapons, narcotics, cash totals, routes, and communication nodes. Behind the podium, exhausted task force leaders watched reporters scribble notes, knowing the public would see only a fraction of what had been uncovered. Because the deeper truth was harder to articulate. Removing core leadership and destroying their infrastructure didn't simply eliminate a criminal enterprise. It created a vacuum, and vacuums attract new predators. Analysts had warned of two possibilities. Smaller groups might attempt to occupy the abandoned corridors, or foreign partners might try to rebuild the network remotely. The region's logistics spine was too valuable, too central, too exposed to ignore. Federal agencies announced a long-term presence in Minnesota, with embedded intelligence units monitoring trucking hubs, rail yards, and container terminals. Local police received new support teams trained in counter-network operations. Community organizations mobilized, launching youth programs and employment pipelines aimed at preventing future recruitment. But the most sobering realization came from evidence housed inside federal storage facilities. Maps marked with routes from East Africa to North America. Financial charts linking Twin Cities businesses to overseas brokers. Communication chains bypassing traditional criminal hierarchies entirely. Minnesota was not chosen randomly. It was chosen because its transportation architecture made it the perfect blind spot. The state's strength was also its vulnerability. What Operation Iron Harvest revealed was not simply a cartel or militia structure, but a modern model for embedding foreign criminal architecture inside a domestic logistics system. The kind of model that others could attempt again in another city along another freight corridor. As agents packed up equipment and prepared for the next phase of prosecutions, many understood the same truth. The battle had been won. But the real war was about awareness, about recognizing how quietly a threat can take root, how deeply it can burrow into the systems that keep a state running, how fast it can grow when no one is watching. Minnesota had been tested in silence. The state endured the storm without realizing it had begun. And now, in the calm that followed, one lesson remained unmistakable. Danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it rides inside a container. Sometimes it hides behind a warehouse wall. Sometimes it grows beneath the very roots that keep a region alive. Operation Iron Harvest tore away the veil. What comes next will determine whether Minnesota ever has to face such a shadow again.